Welcome to Decades of Heistery, where we cover safecrackers and bank heists from 1926 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. Which state do you think had the most heists in 1926? Was there a typical size that comprised a bank robbery gang? Was one day of the week more popular with robbers than others? Did crime pay? We'll look at that, plus we'll reflect on some oddities. We'll look at the unique language for the period and even have a laugh or two with robbers' nicknames. All that and more on the Year in Review 1926 Decades of Heistery. So again, what state would you assume had the most bank robberies in 1926? Illinois, you say? Well, no. Coming in first place for 1926 was California with 12 bank robberies. Placing in the silver medal position was Texas with 11. Those are surprising to me, but if we think about it, in 1926, California and Texas were kind of the Wild West, if not geographically, at least in spirit. Less surprising, perhaps, was third place, Indiana with 9, and Michigan with 8, rounding out the top 4. Funnily enough, we actually covered more bank heists in Cuba and in Canada individually than we did Illinois. In total across the country, we covered heists in 26 different states. How often did a bank robbery actually occur? Was 1 month or 1 season more popular for stealing money from banks? Our study covered 83 cases of bank robbery or closely related cases such as embezzlement. The average number of heists per month was 6.9, so let's call it 7. The highest month for robberies or robbery attempts was September with 10. Why September? My guess is that it was the fall weather, the cooler temperatures, and darker skies with earlier nightfall. That would be helpful for escaping. Conversely, the lowest month was June, with a paltry 3 bank jobs. I suspect more people were out and about with longer days and languid temperatures, making it not conducive to robbing a bank and attempting to escape. The highest season for robberies was fall, autumn, with a total of 23, and the lowest was summer with between 13 and 16. Some were undated, but I applied them to the most logical month. We also handled the aftermath, such as an apprehension or sentencing, of cases between 1921 and 1925, as long as they had some kind of news event in 1926. What we came across was 25 additional cases. What day of the week do you think would be the highest and lowest? Well, there wasn't enough data for this to be super scientific, but some of the articles referenced either the date specifically or made a tangential comment that led me to kind of extrapolate or guess the date. So based on what we know, Friday had the highest incidence. This is what I would have assumed just because of human psychology. Fridays feel different, and people are a bit more free and wild. We have the expression, thank God it's Friday, TGIF. Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday only had 1 referenced each, and that fits to me as well because, well, no one likes Mondays, including bank robbers. Well, the robbers weren't in this for the health plan and the longevity of the career, so let's talk about cash money. Like everything, there are extremes and averages. Our lowest heist in terms of money taken goes to poor old Michael Brochere. He escaped with a paltry $60. He was quickly tracked, he was shot, he was captured, and sentenced for his efforts. Honorable mention for the worst or lowest heist goes to the main crew who absconded with about $100 after they hit the Bar Harbor Banking and Trust Company in Southwest Harbor, Maine. It seems that they aborted the heist after a tree branch fell nearby, took out a power line, and made the bank lights flicker, scaring them into thinking someone was coming. So they fled. On the other extreme We saw a crew use tacks to foil posse's motorized pursuit after looting $1 million in securities and $10,000 in currency from the First National Bank in Columbus, Wisconsin. Another $1 million heist involved two couples who robbed the Merchants Bank in Lanesville, Indiana. This robbery combine was more along the lines of Bonnie and Clyde, with indiscriminate shooting and killing. Deputy Sheriff Alonzo Mayfield was killed in the pursuit. Typically, heists netted between $10,000 and $70,000, which for the time is pretty substantial. So who were these robbers? I assume there's a significant number of World War I veterans who, upon returning home, either couldn't find a way to adjust, couldn't find a job, had been conditioned to a more violent lifestyle, and therefore migrated to, and faced harsh economic times, and therefore migrated to robbery. Hopefully that information will come out in the end. Well, more on who was involved. And speaking of who was involved, we came across some world-class nicknames. I'll save my favorite for last. One robber, whose given and surname were unknown, went by the nickname Whitey. He was killed during a Roseville, California heist. We also met a Canadian thief named Norman Red Ryan as he was languishing in prison. He ended up incidentally being pardoned for good behavior, which included his inventing and patenting a mailbag while in prison. It was all kind of a ruse, however, as he returned to a life of crime shortly after his pardon, and I think it was about 10 months later he was gunned down for his efforts. In addition, we had one Blackie, who was a suspect in an Olmsted County bank robbery in Minnesota, a second Ralston Blackie Linton, who was suspected in the National Bank of Spencer, Indiana, and the Exchange Bank in Indiana robberies. A third Blackie, who was possibly James C. Marsh, and possibly actually had the official full nickname of Oklahoma Blackie, and he'd been involved in the Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin heist. For fun, this James C. Marsh, possibly Oklahoma Blackie, may have teamed up with a Shorty Casey on that Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin job. For more confusion, that James C. Marsh, aka Oklahoma Blackie, may have been confused by contemporaries, authors, and newspaper writers with an Irvin Blackie Thompson. But wait, there's actually more. Howard Johnson, aka Yuma Blackie, who was also known as Three-Fingered Blackie, was seen in a drunken brawl in a California house that resulted in the death of a man named Charles Abel. Mixing color with physical ailments, or today what we call disabilities, we heard from a William J. White, aka Three-Fingered Jack, who teamed up with others on the McHenry, Illinois State Bank and Drovers State Bank robberies, along with a ton of other crimes, and who was not to be confused with, see above, Yuma Blackie, aka Three-Fingered Blackie. Leaving what would probably be considered inappropriate nicknames in today's world, we come across some fun names. Well, except this first one. Let us meet James Killer Cuniff, who was ironically killed in an argument over loot with a gang member in Michigan. Incidentally, Bum Rogers was the gang leader to which Killer Cuniff belonged, or with which he worked. We came across a Norris Lone Wolf Forrest, who was suspected of participation in the New Rockford, North Dakota robbery, but was actually in prison at the time. We also came across Richard Reese Whitmore, aka the Candy Kid, whose girlfriend, Paramore, bore the moniker Tiger Girl. Nicknamed Betty Beeswax in the courtroom for the trial of her man, Gerald Chapman, and a Pocky Dillon, who was Gerald's friend, but also probably the guy who landed him in jail to ultimately face the death penalty. So we've got Betty Beeswax and Pocky Dillon. Chapman was known as the Count of Gramercy Park, the Gentleman Bandit, and Gentleman Gerald. Chapman apparently worked with a George Dutch Anderson in some of his crimes. And speaking of Pocky Dillon, we learned of a Frank Porky Dillon, who was an Al Capone henchman, or is it hench person? Anyway, who was a paroled convict and simultaneously was nominated as the chief of police by Al Capone in the town of Forest View, Illinois, which coincidentally had been taken over by Capone. Along the way, we encountered the Morelli gang, members of which included Pasquale Patsy Morelli, Fred Butsy Morelli, plus some non-family members including Bibber Barone and Gyp the Blood. Gyp the Blood, not to be confused with the other Gyp the Blood, who was from the Rosenthal gang in New York City back in the 1910s or so. There's actually two Gyp the Bloods. We came across Earl Hymie Weiss and Wild Bill Holland. I think, referenced a Wild Bill Henderson down in Florida along the way as well. We honored, as best we could, Raider, probably the nickname of a black trustee who was killed in a prison break down in Texas when he and the prison was attacked. We just learned of a man possibly involved in the Montana, North Dakota spate of crime that occurred in November and December. His name was S.C. Collins, nicknamed Nig, N-I-G. That is a really unusual nickname. I certainly hope it doesn't have a racial reference, but there's no other information, and he was not referred by that nickname again. He was referred to as S.C. Collins. My favorite, however, and the unofficial winner of the 1926 Nickname of the Year Award goes to Charles Mays, M-A-Y-E-S or M-A-Y-S. Kind of a plain name. Perhaps that's why he chose the nickname Pighead Hardman. Pighead Hardman was gunned down in Oklahoma in June 1926. So what would you guess would be the perfect size of a robbery crew or combine? My thesis at first was that a crew would have one getaway driver, one guard to kind of stand watch, and two robbers who were actually in their hands-on, creating a quartet. That seemed ideal to me, and I assumed most of the robbery gangs were going to be just that. However, first place for number of crew members was easily taken by a two-member bank robbery crew. In fact, 21 times it was a duo. Second place was actually a solo lone robber, coming in with 12 instances. Third place was actually the quartet. An honorable mention goes to the unknown category with 9 instances. So 2, 1, and 4 seem to be the way to go, though we did come across some with numbers as high as 11. So we know the wheres and the whens and the whos. How do you think most of these robberies actually worked out? Somewhat surprisingly to me, in 31 examples, the case was ended pretty quickly, with the robbers being caught, put in jail, and eventually sentenced. But 20 times, we actually saw the robbers get away. But the robbers didn't always just give up easily in that category of those who were caught. So how often was there a violent clash, and how did that end for the robbers? We have a category of 1 or 2 robbers being killed. We have one example of the robber escaping successfully and then dying right afterwards, probably from the excitement and stress of a heart attack. We have 4 robbers from the same crew who were sentenced to electrocution. We have 3 in separate instances who were sentenced to hanging in a gallows of some sort. We have a couple different examples of 2 robbers dying in a shootout. We have one example of a robber dying of friendly fire, and we even have one who died in a auto wreck while escaping. Well, it's 1926, it's the Roaring Twenties, and language was different that 100 or so years ago. We came across some peculiar renderings of the English language itself. For example, maybe was used in place of maybe in an article, M-E-B-B-E. The word clues, C-L-E-W-S, was used in another article, and worked, W-I-R-K-E-D, was used for worked, W-O-R-K-E-D, and perhaps this is just the way it was in that period. An expression, read the marks, meaning an ability to track someone. We learned about that in an Arizona story of Sheriff Chappell and his connection to a heist in Gadsden, Arizona, which ended in the death of a cashier teller. Another more fun story was of a California robbery. We noted that the robbers, quote, made away with the swag, end quote. And I actually thought that was a contemporary, at least 2020s term or expression. A somewhat famous poker player turned bank robber named Matty McNeil feared his enemies would, quote, ventilate him, end quote, in jail. A robbery-specific term included Hoosier bankroll, which was a large roll of money that looked substantial, but it was actually single dollars. And of course, the term I think I introduced in the first or second episode, YEG, Y-E-G-G. YEG meant safecracker, though along the way, I saw that it was extended to mean robbers, jewel thieves, highwaymen, gunmen, stick-up men, and hold-up men. And cracksmen was also used for safecracker, and yeggmen was a plural. So, interesting terminology for the robbers themselves. Speaking of which, the term burner was used for those robbers who used acetylene torches to open safes. A Newark leader story referred to Cossacks being equipped by bankers to form a vigilante group that would protect the banks, and I'm guessing that they didn't approve of the concept, which is why they used the term Cossack kind of in a derogatory way. Race-specific terms used at the time, obviously not used today, included Negro, which was used pretty sparingly. However, I think it was used in lieu of the man's given and surname. Although there was the Virginia-based bank robbery gang, and they were named by given and surname. I saw the term colored used even more sparingly, and the term gypsy was used once. Demonstrating, I think, incredible immaturity, the Daily Kennebec Journal referred to a young crew of robbers from New York City as the Booby Bandits due to their youthfulness. They were also called, quote, crybabies, end quote, due to their age and the fact that they all cried when they were taken to jail. We saw the birth of the term domestic science, which according to the Brownsville Herald at the time was the, quote, fancy names for cooking and house cleaning, end quote. And speaking of language and all this data, where did the information come from? Well, we referenced 40 newspapers and tons, which is an unofficial number, of websites as well. Some of the newspapers included the Bismarck Tribune, the Brownsville Herald, Douglas Daily Dispatch, the Evening Star and the Sunday Star out of D.C., the Indianapolis Times, the New Britain Daily Herald, and its two other variations, I think. And so some other substantial papers from around the country. So we have North Dakota, Texas, Arizona, Washington, D.C., Indianapolis, Indiana, New Britain, Connecticut. So we have a pretty good wide range of papers from which we got a lot of the stories. Some of the rare one-offs for really specific localized cases included papers like the Ascoff American, the Ely Miner, the Kevin Review, the Key West Citizen, La Opinion out of LA, the Vashon Island News Record, I think out of Washington State, Wolf Point Herald out of Montana, and so many more. Well, let's end with at least a high note with some fun, in quotes, strange and bizarre stories. I described a robbery that took place in December 1926 as mundane, using brute force, and lacking finesse. However, there were some strange moments that go under the category of oddities. We met a 40-year-old mother and her 18-year-old daughter who robbed, at gunpoint, the Renner State Bank in South Dakota, but left a trail of pennies that led detectives to their house. and their capture. We came across the robber, Edward Keller, who escaped the Corn Exchange National Bank in Philadelphia with $40,000, got into a taxi cab, and had a heart attack and died. We met Yancey Story, who robbed his old friend, Dr. A.H. Knox's bank in Crum, Texas. Story was eventually arrested for that and numerous other crimes. The weird thing is they had chatted in the bank in the morning, and Story even joked about robbing the bank. He came back that afternoon and did it. Well, we met a farmer, last name Perkins, who clearly felt guilty. He went and confessed and showed the police the loot as he dug up 4 coffee cans of gold, silver, and currency that he'd helped steal from a bank in Missouri. I believe it was in DeSoto, Missouri. We learned of a San Antonio, Texas man who was arrested after he was ID'd as the man who carried a sawed-off shotgun in the San Antonio National Bank robbery. He's the one who allegedly held it on one Mrs. J.R. Pierce. He, however, claimed that he'd been taking a bath at the time of the heist and asked, quote, for the truth serum, end quote. Canadian robber Wilfred Bonin was badly injured in a shootout shortly after the heist of the Royal Bank of Canada, I believe in Winnipeg. He ended up having to be carried to the gallows to be hanged. Charles Powell was arrested in Santa Monica, California for a 1925 bank heist. He had finished the contents of a whiskey bottle, threw the bottle in the corner of the bank, unknowingly leaving his fingerprints behind that would end up convicting him. Even sillier, George Waters Ford, who robbed 3 banks, inadvertently ratted on himself after he was hoodwinked by 2 ladies when he called the cops on them because they had stolen the money that he'd stolen first. An otherwise vicious gang of Oklahoma robbers treated an elderly woman who happened to be in the bank they were robbing with southern charm and kindness. They made sure that her money wasn't stolen, and they even helped her to sit in a rocking chair as the heist was taking place. She wasn't even compelled to be locked in the vault when the robbers decided to leave, as long as she promised to remain quiet. A September editorial suggested that jazz music was the cause of the rash of bank robberies sweeping the nation. We met a Wisconsin gang that used tacks at least twice to foil pursuers. And I referred to this as a Batman and Robin tactic from the 1960s Batman and Robin show. We checked in and saw the fracturing of a once great relationship between the Berger and Shelton gangs in Illinois. One of the things that broke them up was the ladders, that would be the Shelton gangs, spreading out to include crimes other than alcohol related. They refitted an oil truck that used to haul booze and converted it into an armored vehicle. That switch was the sign for the Berger gang. We witnessed a couple teens team up with a 21-year-old young woman and pull off robberies using a water pistol. And it worked great until the postal clerk they tried to shake down fired back, killing one of the robbers who was only 18. And lastly, along the way, we met a Dillinger and Edgar Allan Poe. But those were just strange coincidences since neither was the famous one. The Dillinger was a shoe store owner, and the Edgar Allan Poe we met was actually a non-related Maryland lawyer. 1926, it was definitely a year, and it was a good foray into setting a baseline, I guess, for the bank heists that we're going to study now from 1927 up until U.S. involvement in World War II. There's a dedicated 1926 playlist with all 12 months covered along the way. This 1926 year in review will be in there, and the Memorial Honor Roll video, which will be coming out next, will also be in that playlist. For now, I want to thank you for spending your time with Decades of History. Till next time.
Where somebody waits for me, sugar sweet, and so is she. Bye, bye, blackbird.